I have no confession of faith, no hymn upon my lips, no whispered prayer to the master of mankind. My confession is smaller, weaker, and perhaps more dangerous. My confession is boredom. The kind of boredom that seeps into your bones, that wears you down grain by grain until you are nothing but dust waiting to be blown away. It is not a dramatic death, not the roar of bolters or the crack of lost fire. It is slower, crueler. It is the death of monotony. All my life, the only music I have known is the endless hum of machines. A sound so constant, so unchanging, that it has become the sound of silence itself. At first you notice it, the low vibration of cogitators grinding away in the endless halls of the Administratum. But after years, decades, you stop hearing it. You breathe it in like the recycled air and it becomes part of you. A pulse you cannot escape. I am Kaelan, a cogitator scribe, a servant of the Imperium. One among billions in a hive that stretches so far into the smog-choked sky that I doubt anyone has ever seen the sun. If such a thing still exists here. My duty? To process parchment and data slates in an endless river of ink and error, stamping names I will never know, sealing orders I cannot read, shuffling one piece of paper to another. A tiny cog in a machine so vast it cannot be imagined, let alone questioned. My life is not measured in years but in signatures. Not in memories but in stamped seals. Each day the same. Each night indistinguishable from the last. You could burn my entire existence out of the archives and nothing would change. Not the hive. Not the Imperium. Not the galaxy. The ration paste we eat has no taste. Fills the belly and that is all. A gray sludge that mirrors the gray of our lives. Once as a child I remember asking my overseer if real food still existed. Meat, fruit, bread baked in an oven instead of extruded from a dispenser. He struck me across the mouth so hard I tasted blood for days. That was the answer. The Imperium does not ask such questions and neither should we. The air is thick with smog and ash. You breathe it because there is nothing else to breathe. The lumen strips flicker overhead, their dying light casting everything in a perpetual half-shade. They never repair them. Why would they? Light enough to see your papers is light enough to work. And so we work. We work until our eyes blur and our fingers cramp. We work until we no longer know where the day ends or where the night begins. We work until our spines are bent and our minds are as numb as the nutrient paste in our bowls. We work because work is all there is. Some whisper prayers as they stamp documents, their lips moving silently in the rhythm of rote devotion. Others carve tiny marks into their desks, desperate to leave behind some proof that they existed. I do neither. I have no prayers left, no faith to waste on a God who demands only suffering. And as for marks, what proof would they be? One scratch among billions. One more forgotten ghost in an ocean of forgotten ghosts. The Administratum calls it order. The priests call it duty. I call it silence. The silence of sameness. The silence of an existence that never changes. The silence of a man who has stopped being alive, but has not yet died. And I ask myself, in the rare moments when my thoughts wander, what is worse? The silence of death? Or this endless hum, this grinding noise that has devoured my life and hollowed me out until all that remains is a shell with a quill and a stamp? I do not fear battle, for I have never seen it. I do not fear heresy, for I have never known anything but obedience. What I fear is that this is all there is. That this gray, endless monotony is the truth of life in the Imperium. That boredom, not bolters, is how humanity ends. That is my confession. Not of treason, not of doubt, but of boredom. And in this galaxy, perhaps that is the greatest heresy of all. Indoctrination and illusions. I cannot remember a time when I didn't hear the hymns. They were always there, playing softly through the cracked speakers in every corner of the hive. From the day I first opened my eyes, the voices of the faithful had been my lullaby, my waking call, my everything. The Imperium's hymn was the heartbeat of my world, and we sang it because we had no choice. It was woven into the very fabric of our lives, like the air we breathed, the food we ate, the dull gray of the buildings that surrounded us. It wasn't just the hymn that filled the silence, it was the words. Oh, how the words drilled into us, day after day. I remember sitting in the cramped, drab classroom of the Spire Sector Secondary, watching the holoscreen flicker as a stern-faced instructor recited the Imperial Creed. The Emperor guides us, she would say, her voice monotone and mechanical, like the cogitators that ran the Administratum. The Emperor watches over us. His will is our will. and we were supposed to believe it. But I didn't. Not at first. I was young then, just a child, eager to learn, full of questions. Every now and then, a sliver of doubt would creep in, like a splinter under the skin. There were days when the hymns felt hollow, like an echo in an empty room. The words didn't match the world around me. The Emperor, the ever-watchful protector, they said, but where was he? There were children in the class who believed it wholeheartedly. They would recite the prayers with the same fervor they put into their studies, as if their faith could shield them from the cold emptiness of our lives. But even as a boy, I could see it in their eyes. They were playing the game. They were pretending just like the rest of us. Pretending to believe because it was the only way to survive. The fear was always there, beneath the surface. Always. It wasn't the kind of fear that made you shake or sweat, but the kind that quietly poisoned every thought, every moment. Fear was the foundation of everything we did. The hymns told us of the Emperor's light, but the propaganda told us of the consequences of defying it. Heretics would burn. Traitors would be purged. And somewhere in the back of my mind, I began to wonder if those words meant something more than just a threat. I remember my first lesson in the cost of doubt. It was simple, really, like everything else in those early years. I was sitting in class, gazing out at the flickering hollow screen, when one of the boys, Darius, asked a question. It wasn't a rebellious question. No, he asked as innocently as a child could. Why does the Emperor need so many of us to die? I remember the silence that followed. It wasn't the shocked silence you might expect. It wasn't the kind of moment where the teacher would scream or punish a student for asking something dangerous. No, it was worse. It was the kind of silence where everyone in the room froze, as if they all knew that the answer could never be spoken aloud. The teacher didn't answer him right away. She just looked at him for a moment, her face as cold and impassive as the walls of the classroom. Then she turned back to the hollow screen, and without a single flicker of emotion she said, "The Emperor needs us to die so that we can serve the Imperium. And that is the only thing that matters." Darius never asked another question. In fact, after that day none of us did. The words "serve the Imperium" became a mantra. They were hammered into us every single day from the first lesson to the last. And over time I understood what they really meant. Survival. Obedience wasn't a virtue, it was the only way to stay alive. To serve was to live. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that, deep down, I knew the truth and so did everyone else. It was like a disease that spread across the hive, subtle and unspoken. We were cogs in a machine that didn't care if we were happy or free. The machine only cared about function. And for the first time I understood. In a world where death was a constant threat, obedience was the key to survival. Not virtue. Not hope. Not faith. Just obedience. And so, I obeyed. I don't know when it happened, when the shift occurred, but I know it was gradual. It didn't feel like an epiphany, but rather a slow realization that I had no choice. You don't resist the weight of an entire galaxy. You don't fight the Imperium because that means you're dead. You don't ask questions because the questions will kill you. So, I put my head down, swallowed my doubts, and fell in line like everyone else. Obedience became my shield. My survival instinct. I wasn't a child anymore, full of hope or questions. I was a worker. A unit. And like every cog in a machine, I had one purpose: to serve. But that was the first crack. And cracks, you see, have a funny way of growing. Taxes and tributes. The day the tithe was announced, it felt like the floor beneath me shifted. The air grew heavier, thicker, as though the very fabric of the hive itself had become suffused with the weight of the Imperium's demands. There is a sound, you see, when you've lived long enough in a place like this, a sound you don't notice until it's too late, the low hum of inevitability. The adept appeared from the shadows, his robe dragging across the grime-covered floor. His presence was one of mechanical indifference. He was a cog in the machine, and I knew this because I could see the wear on his face, the same wear I had seen in every bureaucrat, every low-level functionary, hollow, tired, resigned. He didn't need to say much, but his voice rang out across the hall, bouncing off the sterile, gray walls. "The tithe is upon us," he said, his voice flat and cold. "All must comply as per the decree of the Imperium." No one reacted. No one ever did. The announcement of the tithe was nothing new, nothing remarkable. It was a ritual as old as the hive itself. But this time something in the air felt different. The pressure was heavier, more suffocating. I could feel it in the silence that stretched between his words, in the tense, strained faces around me. The adept continued with the monotony of someone repeating a line they had said 1,000 times before. "There will be no exceptions. All must contribute. All will give their share." and the tithe would come. It always did. Food, resources, people. Every year the quota grew more and more demanding. Every year the weight of the Imperium pressed harder. There were whispers in the corners of the hive, of feasts up in the spires, where the elite dined on luxuries unimagined by those of us who toiled below. But none of us ever saw the feast. The spires were a place where the air was clean, the food was rich, and the world spun in a different rhythm. Not for us. Down here our ration packs were bland, gray, tasteless mush, the nutrient paste. It filled the stomach, but it did nothing for the soul. The taste of it became familiar, a reminder of our place, our role in the Imperium's grand design. We were nothing but gears in a machine, and the paste was the fuel that kept us turning. There were rumors, of course, of the spire feasts, the platters of roasted meats, the sweet fruits from distant worlds, the fine wines flowing like rivers. But those were stories told in hushed voices, a fleeting moment of fantasy for the workers, the cogitators, the men and women who would never taste such pleasures. Those stories were as empty as the paste in our bowls. Still, there was something we all feared. Something deeper than the ration packs, deeper than the endless hum of cogitators. It was the fear of being noticed. It was always the Arbites who were the most terrifying part of the tithe. They were the ones who came to inspect, to make sure that the quotas were met, to make sure that none of us had slipped through the cracks. And when the Arbites came, it wasn't like anything else. They didn't talk. They didn't need to. Their presence was enough to silence the hive, to make even the loudest voices tremble in fear. Their armor was the first thing you noticed, pitch black with a dull sheen that seemed to swallow the dim light of the hive. They moved like shadows, silent and imposing, their helmets obscured by faceless visors. To see them was to see the final authority, the enforcers of the Emperor's will, the ones who had the power to decide life or death with a mere gesture. And that was the true horror of it, the ease with which they decided our fate. You could be walking along, just another face in the crowd, and then the Arbites would appear. Their cold, blank eyes would scan the crowd, looking for those who weren't pulling their weight, those who hadn't given enough, those who had failed. A single gesture, a single word, and you would be dragged away. To the cells. To the penal worlds. Or worse. I remember the first time I saw it happen. A man just like me, just another cog in the machine, walking beside me in the queue. The Arbites came, moving through the crowd like a tide of steel and death. The man froze as they passed by him. They stopped, their helmets turning toward him. Without a word, one of the Arbites reached out, grabbed him by the collar and dragged him away. His face was a picture of confusion, of fear, but there was nothing he could do. He had failed. And in the Imperium, failure meant punishment. That was the moment when I realized how fragile we all were. How easily we could be erased. How close we all were to being noticed. And from that day forward, I feared them. Not the adepts, not the faceless scribes or the distant lords in the spires. I feared the Arbites. They were the true enforcers of the Imperium, the embodiment of everything we served. We had been told our entire lives that our duty was to the Emperor, to the Imperium. But what they never told us was that duty wasn't just about servitude. It was about obedience. And obedience was what kept us alive. Disobedience, even in the smallest form, would get you noticed. And once you were noticed, there was no going back. It wasn't a violent death that terrified me. It was the quiet, inevitable consequences of failure. The cold, impassive judgment of the Arbites. And the thought of being noticed, of being seen as less than what I was, filled me with an icy dread. So I obeyed. I kept my head down, kept my thoughts to myself, and made sure the quota was met. Because the truth was, the only thing that mattered in the hive was survival. Everything else was secondary. The Agri-Worlds harvest. The first time I saw the Agri-World, I thought I was dreaming. Or perhaps it was more fitting to call it a nightmare. The journey there was silent. The transport was nothing more than a metal coffin, packed with other prisoners, our faces hollowed out from years of toil and despair. We sat shoulder to shoulder, no one speaking, each lost in their thoughts, knowing that whatever awaited us on the Agri-World could only be worse than what we had left behind. I had been drafted for a clerical error. A mistake on my part, insignificant to anyone else but enough for me to be marked. I had misfiled a report, a simple mistake that anyone could have made. But in the Imperium there are no second chances. The adepts had their rules, and to break them was to break the system. And so, I found myself on a transport headed toward an Agri-World, a fate worse than death, a fate that awaited those who had no place in the orderly chaos of the Administratum. The ship dropped us off, and as the heavy doors opened, the air hit me like a physical blow. The stench of rot, of earth long deprived of care, of something putrid and stagnant. The air was thick with dust and humidity, and I could feel it in my lungs as soon as I breathed in. It wasn't the cold, sterile air of the hive but something far more oppressive, something that choked the very life out of you. The sky above was choked with clouds, dark and oppressive. There was no sunlight here, only a smothering gray blanket that hung low over the land. The fields stretched out before me, endless rows of lifeless, poisoned crops. Crops grown in uniformity, all of them looking the same, all of them doomed to the same fate. The ground was blackened, as though the very earth had given up on trying to nourish life. No variety. No lush pastures. Just the repetitive, unforgiving monotony of row upon row of genetically engineered, monoculture crops. It was a factory of life, one that produced the same thing over and over again without care for the land or those who worked it. The overseers, dressed in the same dull gray as the machinery they controlled, marched through the fields with the quiet authority of men who had no need to speak. They didn't need to. Their mere presence was enough to enforce the rules, the endless quotas, the endless need for production. Every day we were tasked with harvesting the crops, our hands stained with soil, our bodies pushed to the brink of exhaustion. The work never stopped. There was no rest. Every day we toiled beneath the same suffocating sky, doing the same work with no hope of change. And my hands? My hands were not the soft hands of a scribe anymore. They were raw. The skin cracked and bled under the strain of constant labor. The work was unrelenting. My fingers were covered in blisters, my palms raw from gripping tools I had never touched before. The crops didn't care. The soil didn't care. It was an endless battle to get the harvest in on time, and every failure brought more punishment, more hardship. At night, I would lie in the barracks, exhausted to the bone, staring at the low ceiling. There was no warmth in the air. No comfort. Just the constant hum of the machinery that governed the entire world. The rumbling of engines, the grinding of gears, the same noise that had filled the Administratum back home. The same noise that had been the soundtrack of my life, and now it was here too. It wasn't long before I realized the truth. The truth that had been hidden from me in the hive, in the sterilized silence of the cogitator banks. The truth that had been buried beneath the propaganda, beneath the ceaseless hymn of the Imperium. The truth was that the gray, sterile life I had led in the hive was a kinder prison. At least in the hive I had been numb to it all. I had been locked in a cell of my own making, where I could escape into the hum of the machines, the endless paperwork and the cold, lifeless routine. But here there was no escape. The monotony was far worse than anything I had known. The endless days in the fields, the sunless sky, the constant, grinding pain in my body. My back was bent from the labor, my body screaming in protest every time I had to bend down to the soil. The heat, the weight, the dust, it all pressed in on me, suffocating any hope that might have lingered in my soul. This was a prison too, but it was not a quiet one. It was alive with the constant noise of toil. The labor was brutal, and my body, once a mere tool of the Administratum, had become something else entirely. It had become a machine, a part of the factory that would never stop. It was a life without rest, without relief, without any of the small comforts that had once made the monotony bearable. I remember thinking as I stood there in the fields, how much I longed for the grayness of the hive again. The calm of the cogitators, the quiet hum of the machines. At least then I had the illusion of purpose. But now I was nothing but a cog in a different machine. I had traded one prison for another, but this one felt more oppressive. There was no escape. The realization hit me like a hammer. I was nothing but a tool, a cog that would turn and turn until it broke. The Imperium had promised me a life of service. But in the end all it had given me was pain and endless toil. But there was no way out. There never had been. The Forge World's fire. The ship's engines hummed with the same sterile precision as all the others, the same rhythm I had come to know in every transport I'd ever boarded. But this one felt different. It wasn't the quiet hum of the Administratum's cogitators or the suffocating rhythm of the Agri-Worlds' endless labor. No, this was something harsher, more brutal, more alive with the heat of industry. The Forge World awaited me. I had been promised a promotion of sorts, a better life, they said. To leave the fields behind, to leave the Agri-Worlds' back-breaking toil and step into the heart of the Imperium's industrial machine. The Adeptus Mechanicus, they told me, valued skilled labor. The work I had done as a lowly cogitator technician had earned me this chance. But nothing in the hive had prepared me for the furnace world that I was now heading toward. The planet was nothing like what I had imagined. It wasn't the barren landscape of agricultural farms or the smog-choked skies of the hive cities. It was far worse. The atmosphere was thick with ash and soot, a choking, oppressive weight that hung in the air like a constant suffocation. From the moment I stepped off the ship, I could taste the burning metal, feel the heat searing my skin as if the planet itself was alive, a beast with an insatiable hunger. The ground beneath my boots was soft, molten, blackened metal that flowed like tar, constantly shifting underfoot. I was assigned to a furnace, a massive forge that stretched far beyond what the eye could see. Towers of burning iron rose up like spires to a god, their molten cores casting an eerie glow across the blackened land. The machines that hummed, rattled, and groaned were unlike anything I had seen before. Massive, ancient, and impossibly complex, they seemed to pulse with a life of their own. The tech priests moved between them like ghosts, their mechanical limbs whirring in a practiced, terrifying rhythm, as though they were part of the machine itself. The Shrine World's Prayer. I was old when they sent me to the Shrine World. Not old in the way that men of my age should be, bent with age and fragile in body. No, I was old because the Imperium had worn me down year after year, task after task, until there was nothing left of the man I had once been. The ambition that had driven me as a young cogitator technician had been ground down to dust beneath the wheels of the Imperium's machinery. The enthusiasm I had once held for simple duty had withered away, replaced with a dull, empty obedience. A life of rote, a life of numb submission. And yet, they sent me to the Shrine World as if it were a reward, a cleansing, a final act of penance. A promotion, they called it, a chance to spend my remaining years in atonement for my sins. It was an ironic joke and I was the punchline. I arrived under the cover of darkness, my transport ship gliding into the shadow of the Shrine World's massive spires, their silhouette cutting through the haze like the broken bones of a fallen god. The very sight of the planet should have filled me with reverence, but all it did was remind me of how far I had fallen. The spires rose like a twisted cathedral to a god that had forgotten the meaning of mercy. Around them, the world pulsed with the relentless rhythm of prayer, an eternal hymn that never faltered, a chorus of souls that had long since given up the will to live. The first thing I noticed when I arrived was the sound. There was no silence here. No calm, no moment of respite. The chanting filled the air, seeping into every corner of the world, wrapping its tendrils around everything like a suffocating fog. It was constant, relentless, as if the world itself was locked in an eternal state of penance. The prayer didn't stop for sleep, for meals, for anything. And I too was expected to join in, to add my voice to the hymn. But my voice felt hollow, empty. I had long ago lost my connection to the Emperor. He was no longer a savior to me, but a distant figure who seemed as much a prisoner to this world as I was. I was assigned to a vast hall, a grand structure dedicated to the Emperor's worship, but it was no sanctuary. It was a prison of devotion. The walls were adorned with intricate mosaics of golden saints, but the very gold seemed tarnished, worn down by the years of suffering and worship. The floor was cold stone, and the air was thick with incense and sweat. The sweet, suffocating perfume of piety clung to everything, choking me with its unyielding presence. The people here, the devotees, were a reflection of me, yet not. They had given everything. Their lives were spent in service to the Emperor, in prayer and penitence, their bodies marked with scars from flagellation, their faces hollow from exhaustion. They were not here because they believed, not in the way the Imperium wanted them to. They were here because they had nowhere else to go. They were here because, like me, they had been broken by the weight of the Imperium's demands. And yet, as much as they were the same as me, I was different. I was here to atone for my sins, sins I didn't even know I had committed. The irony sat heavily on my chest, a burden I could not shake. I had once been a servant of the Emperor, once been a cog in the great machine. But now I was nothing. Just another soul in this endless cycle of prayers, of punishment, of eternal suffering. I had chosen to live as a cog, and now I was being forced to live as one again, but this time in the name of piety. I was surrounded by the chanting, by the endless flagellation, by the oppressive weight of judgment. It wasn't a life of service, it was a life of punishment. Every day felt like an eternity. The constant prayers, the endless devotions, the self-inflicted suffering, it all blended into a blur of monotony, one indistinguishable from the next. My body ached from kneeling for hours in the same cold stone halls, my mind felt fogged by the endless repetition of hymns, and my spirit grew weaker with each passing day. I had thought the Agri-World had been bad. I had thought the Forge World's fire was the most grueling fate a man could face. But this was something far worse. It wasn't the labor that broke me. It wasn't the sweat or the toil. It was the constant, soul-crushing realization that I was trapped in a never-ending cycle of penitence that could not, bring salvation. Every act of devotion, every prayer, every flogging, they were all the same. They were all meaningless. The harder we worked, the more we prayed, the more we suffered, the further we were from the truth. The Emperor's light was no beacon here. It was a distant, unreachable star, a symbol that had been stripped of all its meaning. We were not serving the Emperor here. We were simply serving. It was nothing more than a distraction, a punishment, and I was a prisoner just like the others. We all were. And that was the cruelest irony of all. The world I had once hoped would bring me peace, a final place of redemption, had become a prison far worse than any I had known. I had escaped the grueling toil of the Agri-World, the brutality of the forge, but in the end, I had only swapped one cage for another. The gray monotony of my life in the Administratum had been a kinder prison, because at least I had been numb. Here I was alive. And the pain of being alive, of being constantly aware of my own suffering, was unbearable. The endless chanting, the endless flagellation, the endless prayers, it all became one overwhelming noise that drowned out every shred of hope I had left. There was no salvation here. Only more of the same. The thought hit me like a cold wave. The hive world, the agri-world, the forge world, they were all the same. And now I was trapped in the worst one of all. I was a prisoner to faith, a faith that was as hollow as the gray walls of the hive. I had escaped nothing. I had only traded one chain for another. And there would be no escape from this, no salvation, no redemption. The human cost. The years had worn me down as years tend to do. I had always believed that the greater the service, the greater the reward. That was the lie they told us in the beginning, the one they repeated over and over until it became as familiar as the gray monotony of the world we lived in. The reality was far crueler. Every step forward, every so-called promotion, was nothing more than a shifting of the chains, a new form of servitude hidden behind a different mask. At first it hadn't seemed so bad. The work in the hive, the endless hours in the cogitator banks, the ceaseless filing of documents, it had been numbing sure, but it was something to do. A life of routine. I believed, as they had told me, that service to the Imperium was an honor. It was only in the endless years of toil that I began to understand the true nature of my place in this universe. I had moved from one form of labor to another, from the endless gray halls of the Administratum to the brutal monotony of the Agri-World, to the fires of the forge world, each time told that this was my destiny, my place in the grand design. But each new life had come with its own cost, its own price that had to be paid. The sickness began in small ways at first. It wasn't the kind of sickness that came with a fever or a cough. No, it was more insidious. The first signs were barely noticeable. A stiffness in my joints, an ache in my lower back that wouldn't go away, a fatigue that clung to my bones like a shadow. I brushed it off. Who had time for sickness? Not a worker. Not a servant of the Imperium. But as the months dragged on, the pain deepened. My body, once a tool of industry, began to fail. The skin on my hands grew thin and cracked from the constant labor. I had worked my fingers to the bone, quite literally, until the bones themselves ached with every movement. The work on the forge world, lifting heavy materials, standing for hours beneath the oppressive heat, had taken its toll. And I had not been able to escape it. There was no respite. Not in the factories. Not in the fields. Not even in the silence of the shrine world. And so I began to wither. I grew thinner, my once muscular frame now weak and fragile. My legs no longer supported me with the same strength. My chest would tighten when I tried to take a full breath. The numbness spread. It wasn't just physical. My soul too felt as though it had been worn away. The pain was constant, a reminder that I was no longer a man. I was a tool. And tools break. The worst part was the realization that my body wasn't failing from some external wound, some battle fought or injury sustained. No, it was failing because of the years of relentless service. The constant toil, the ceaseless, grinding repetition, the never-ending obedience to the Imperium's demands, all of it had led me here. I had given my life to this cause, and what had it brought me? Sickness. Failure. A slow, inevitable death, 1 inch at a time. It was as though the Imperium had promised me everything and delivered nothing. Every time I had moved up, every time I had progressed, I had only shifted into a new form of servitude. From the cogitator banks to the agri-world, to the forge, to the shrine, each promotion had been a tightening of the leash, each step a new chapter in a never-ending cycle of duty without reward, of sacrifice without glory. I had become a number. A cog in the machine of the Imperium. No more than that. Every place I had been sent, every new job, every new world, it had all been designed to strip away what was left of my humanity until I was nothing but a shell, a husk of what I had once been. The job had never changed. It had only gotten worse. The endless monotony of it all. The futility. And now my body had started to betray me. My hands shook as I tried to grip a wrench to tighten a bolt, and the machine tools I once commanded with ease now seemed too heavy for my failing frame. It was as if the universe itself had conspired to show me how irrelevant I had become. My body was no longer the tool of industry. It had become the broken part of a machine that was being discarded. But this wasn't the first time I had felt the weight of the Imperium's indifference. When I was first drafted into the Agri-World, I had believed it would be a fresh start. A chance to do something real. I was mistaken. The Agri-World had been nothing but another prison. The Forge World had promised a promotion, but in reality, it was a place where I became even more insignificant, my humanity stripped away by the overwhelming mechanical grip of the Adeptus Mechanicus. Even the Shrine World, where I had been sent to atone, had only been a step toward the final death of my spirit. The endless prayers, the flagellation, the worship of a god that demanded nothing but the complete surrender of my will. It had broken me, and yet I could never escape it. I began to dread the thought of becoming a servitor more than I feared death itself. A servitor, I thought, was a fate worse than any punishment. To be stripped of everything, to be nothing more than a tool for the Imperium, to lose all semblance of will or identity, was worse than the slow decay of my body. At least death was final. And yet, despite everything, I felt a strange peace. The pain in my body, the exhaustion that clung to me like a second skin, seemed to be part of the price I had to pay for all I had endured. Every crack in my hands, every ache in my body, felt like it belonged to the universe, like a mark of my servitude. I was not a man. I was never a man. I was just another number, just another cog in the machine. And it was only in my final years that I came to accept it. The void ship's rhythm. I had thought my life had settled into the predictable misery of the Shrine World, but fate had other plans. In my late years I was pressed, though they called it reassigned for the greater good, into service aboard a void ship. The word service was a polite veneer over what was little more than a life sentence in a moving coffin that skimmed the edges of the Imperium. The ship itself was a maze of cramped corridors, pipes running along every wall, and bunks stacked like coffins in the lower decks. The air was recycled and heavy, smelling faintly of oil, sweat, and the chemical tang of stabilizers. It was a world unto itself, a self-contained microcosm of the Imperium. Every sound, the hiss of a coolant vent, the groan of a bulkhead under stress, the echo of hurried footsteps, was magnified, filling the narrow spaces with a constant hum of tension. I was assigned to menial maintenance, tending to the engines, recalibrating sensors, and patching worn conduits. My hands, already worn and stiff from decades of service on Agri-Worlds and Shrine Worlds, protested every task. Each tool felt foreign, every movement a reminder that my body was no longer my own. Around me, the crew moved with the same practiced efficiency, faces drawn, eyes hollowed by years in the void. We were a collection of shadows, performing rituals of survival without end. The Geller field was our only protection against the warp. It was an invisible shroud, a fragile barrier separating us from the horrors that lurked beyond reality itself. On a particularly long voyage, the field faltered. I remember the first moment I saw it, a subtle distortion in the air, a shimmer across the viewport, almost imperceptible at first. Then the shadows began to twist. Crew members screamed, their eyes wide with unspeakable terror. Forms moved that should not exist, shapes writhing, impossible geometries pressing against the thin membrane of reality. We were trained to maintain composure, to perform our duties no matter the anomaly, but the terror was tangible. I felt it in my chest, a weight pressing down like a millstone. The oldest engineer muttered prayers under his breath, though none of us truly believed the words would protect us. The youngest recruits wept silently, hands trembling as they tightened fasteners or patched energy conduits. I held my wrench with a grip born of decades of endurance, but my hands shook anyway. Even when the field stabilized, the damage was done. Every member of the crew carried the memory of what they had seen. Their faces were etched with an understanding that reality was not fixed, that the universe was indifferent to our existence. The warp had reached into their minds, leaving scars that were invisible but unrelenting. And so we continued. Maintenance became our lifeline, the endless checks and adjustments a fragile attempt to reclaim some control over a chaotic reality that could snatch our lives without warning. Meals were synthetic, tasteless paste that did little to sustain morale. Sleep was broken and shallow, hours stolen in microcycles while the engines hummed and the warp threatened to intrude again. Conversation was minimal, there was nothing to say, no comfort to be found. We existed in a liminal space, neither living fully nor yet dead, tethered to the fragile heartbeat of the Geller field. I began to understand the subtle, permanent transformation of the human psyche under such conditions. Fear became routine. Panic became a tool to be suppressed. Hope was a dangerous luxury. And yet, amidst this perpetual dread, a grim camaraderie formed. Silent glances of acknowledgement, shared burdens of repairs, the unspoken understanding of our collective vulnerability, these were our tenuous connections. I came to dread not the work itself but the consequences of failure. Each error, each misalignment, each misread gauge could bring annihilation, and yet we persisted. Survival was measured not in comfort or victory, but in the unbroken continuation of duty, day after day, shift after shift. Those who could not endure simply vanished, either lost to the warp or removed quietly, their absence noted only in the ship's log. The Underhive's grime. I had heard whispers of the Underhive long before I ever set foot near its blackened, twisting tunnels. Fellow laborers in the lower levels of the Agri-World would speak of it in hushed tones, voices dropping to a conspiratorial murmur as if the walls themselves were listening. They spoke of a world below the world, a labyrinth of filth and shadows where law had no meaning, where the only justice came from the quick and the strong. I had never imagined I would see it for myself. When I finally descended, the air hit me first, acrid, thick, carrying the stench of rot, unwashed flesh, and the ever-present tang of metal and oil. The sky above was a distant, pale smear barely visible through the industrial haze, and yet, down here, the Underhive was alive with movement. I saw gangs of scavengers darting between broken machinery, their bodies lean and scarred, faces hardened by a life where trust was currency and death was a constant companion. They moved like shadows, their eyes alert, always calculating, always wary. The ground itself was a patchwork of refuse and crude repair, puddles of acidic water reflecting dim, sputtering lumens, wires snaking across broken floor panels, and piles of discarded tech devices that had failed their masters above. Every step I took, my boots squelching in the muck, reminded me that this world was one of survival, not glory. The sounds of the Underhive were a chaotic symphony, the clatter of scavenged metal, the distant yells of dispute, the occasional scream that would cut through the dim like a blade. Yet amidst the grime and chaos, there was a certain rhythm, a raw honesty that the Hive's sterile bureaucracy could never replicate. Life here was immediate, brutal, and fleeting. There was no ledger to check, no quota to meet, no endless petition to file. You survived if you were cunning, if you were fast, if you could outthink or outfight your neighbors. And if you failed, you simply did not survive. There was freedom here of a sort. The freedom to live or die by your own hand, not by the whims of an indifferent system that measured you in numbers and quotas. I walked the narrow alleys between stacked dwellings made from scrap and salvaged materials, observing the inhabitants. Children with hollow eyes scavenged through the refuse of the upper spires, their small hands clawing at twisted metal or spoiled rations. Adolescents formed packs, banding together for protection, for meat, for territory. Every face told a story of hunger, of loss, of cruelty endured and inflicted. And yet, in that suffering, there was a raw vitality that I had never seen in the sterile corridors of the Administratum or the ordered fields of the Agri-World. I saw a gang corner a scavenger, a pale youth trembling in the shadows. The attack was swift, brutal, and efficient. There was no hesitation. The boy fell, life extinguished without ceremony. The gangers moved on as if nothing had happened, a chilling reminder of the merciless nature of this world. And yet, the gangers themselves were not truly free. They, too, were bound to the cycle of violence, dependent on the chaos that sustained them. In a sense, we were all slaves here, but at least the terms were clear. That was the bitter lesson of the Underhive. Freedom existed only in the ability to face the constant threat of death and still move forward. The penal legions. The sentence came without ceremony, without any pretense of fairness. I was accused of negligence, a minor oversight in the records of the Administratum, something that would have been ignored in another life on another world. But here, in the relentless machinery of the Imperium, even a single misstep was a mark against you. My punishment was swift and absolute. I was sentenced to the penal legions. The first time they strapped the explosive collar around my neck, I felt a cold certainty settle over me. It was not fear, not yet. It was understanding. Every step I would take from now on would be a dance with death. Each breath, each movement, measured against the cruel probability of survival. The Adeptus Arbites made no words of comfort. They did not need to. The collar alone spoke volumes. Obedience or obliteration. Thrown into the front lines of a distant war-torn world, the reality of my sentence became immediate and unrelenting. The air smelled of gunpowder, burnt promethium, and the iron tang of blood. Around me, men and women already hardened by the penal legions moved with a grim, terrifying rhythm, their bodies bruised, their faces gaunt. Some whispered prayers to the Emperor. Others cursed their lot and prepared to die again because every day in every firefight, death was just a hair's breadth away. The combat was relentless, a ceaseless cycle of attack and retreat. The enemy, Xenos or traitor regiments, it scarcely mattered, moved with deadly precision, and each encounter was a gamble. Heads you die. Tails you die later. There was no victory here, no honor, only the ephemeral survival that lasted until the next barrage, the next hail of fire, the next crushing blow. My hands, already cracked and calloused from years of labor on the Agri-World, became instruments of war. Each weapon I carried, from stubguns to Lost rifles, felt heavier with the knowledge that one misfire, one slip, could be the difference between a short, explosive death and a long, slow decay on a battle-strewn plain. And the collars themselves, the ever-present reminder of my expendability, hummed faintly against my skin, an unrelenting heartbeat of threat. I learned quickly that in the penal legions there was no camaraderie. Comradeship was a luxury, trust was fatal. Each individual fought for survival, each body a temporary asset in a system that expected attrition. Those who faltered, who hesitated, were discarded without ceremony. I watched dozens of recruits vanish in a day, swept away by artillery, ambushes, or the mechanical detonation of their own collars. Silence then smoke. That was the rhythm of life. Despite the relentless brutality, there was a perverse clarity in this existence. Here I understood the truth of the Imperium. The individual was irrelevant. Loyalty, bravery, morality, these were words, concepts that held no weight. Only utility and compliance mattered. And for the penal legions, utility was measured in how many lives you could expend before the collar ended your own. In the quiet moments between firefights, I reflected on my journey. From the gray monotony of the Administratum to the poisoned fields of the Agri-World, from the furnaces of the Forge World to the pious absurdities of the Shrine World, each step had been a march toward this truth. The Imperium consumed its own with an efficiency that was terrifying and absolute. The Imperial Navy's duty. Once more I was uprooted, sent to serve aboard an Imperial Navy vessel. My new role was that of a deckhand, a lowly cog beneath the unyielding authority of a cold, distant officer. Orders were absolute, the slightest hesitation punished by reprimand, or worse. The void was a silent predator. In the distance, the enemy struck without mercy, and I witnessed entire fleets shattered in a heartbeat. Thousands of lives extinguished, vaporized in the cold expanse of space, their deaths recorded only in impersonal logs. There was no honor, no recognition, only the endless rhythm of survival and sacrifice. Every day, the hum of the ship, the hiss of cooling vents, and the ceaseless drills reminded me that the galaxy consumed lives as effortlessly as fire consumes fuel. We moved, we obeyed, we endured, and yet every moment was tinged with the knowledge that life here was fragile and fleeting. Even amidst the chaos, I learned the cruel discipline of the Navy. To survive, one had to become invisible, a tool for the greater machine. Fear and duty intertwined, shaping every action and thought. And though my body endured, my soul was stretched thin, a silent witness to the galaxy's unrelenting hunger. The Inquisitor's watch. I found myself before the Inquisitor, an imposing figure draped in black robes and bearing the weight of authority that could unmake lives with a single word. His eyes, though sharp and commanding, betrayed a hidden exhaustion, the haunted look of a man forced to choose between thousands of lives, each decision a blade that cut deeper than any Xeno's weapon. The interrogation was silent at first, the room heavy with expectation. Every question was a scalpel, dissecting not only my actions but the very essence of who I had become. I realized then that even those who serve with absolute power are prisoners of their own conscience. The Inquisitor bore a burden invisible to the common citizen. The constant knowledge that inaction is complicity, and action is always imperfect, always deadly. As he studied me, I felt the suffocating tension of his gaze. Each pause, each deliberate glance, was a reminder that even the strongest among us are trapped, bound by duty and necessity in a web of moral compromises too vast for any one man to carry. In that moment, I understood a terrifying truth. In the Imperium, power does not grant freedom. It only magnifies the weight of responsibility, leaving even the mighty as shackled as the lowliest worker in the hive. The room seemed to shrink under the gravity of that realization. My life, already fractured by decades of servitude, now felt insignificant against the enormity of decisions the Inquisitor must endure daily. Survival, obedience, and fear were universal chains, binding us all high and low, in a relentless cycle from which no one truly escapes. The Rogue Trader's Gambit. For a fleeting stretch of my endless service, I found myself aboard a rogue trader's vessel, a world unto itself drifting through the void. The halls were vast and ornate, illuminated by gleaming braziers and soft lumens, lined with tapestries depicting forgotten conquests and alien worlds plundered for profit. The air carried the scent of exotic spices, rich wines, and perfumed finery, a stark contrast to the recycled staleness of a void ship or the choking dust of an Agri-World. For a moment I felt almost human, almost free. We dined on lavish feasts, played games of chance that would have bankrupted a hive city, and navigated through decadent chambers where every indulgence seemed permitted. The rogue trader himself moved with an effortless authority, a man whose very existence was a testament to cunning and audacity. But wealth, I soon realized, was merely a gilded cage. Paranoia dripped from every corner, alliances were temporary, smiles were knives in waiting, and every gesture of kindness was weighed against suspicion and potential betrayal. The crew whispered in corridors, their eyes darting constantly, always calculating advantage. I learned quickly, here power and luxury did not equate to security or peace. They only sharpened the edges of danger, turning every friend into a potential threat, every meal into a reminder of fragile mortality. Even amid the splendor, I understood the same grim truth that had followed me through every transfer and assignment. Freedom in the Imperium is an illusion. Each privilege carried an unseen cost, each indulgence a hidden risk. The knives were always there, unseen but always threatening, and the golden walls could not shield anyone from the cold, impartial hand of fate. By the end of my tenure aboard the vessel, I had learned that survival was not measured by comfort or opulence, but by vigilance and the capacity to navigate treachery without faltering. Even here, in the rarest light of wealth and luxury, the galaxy reminded me of its indifference, its appetite for lives sacrificed, and the fragility of any notion of safety. The Mechanicus's Prayer. The Forge world had taught me the meaning of obedience, the pain of labor, and the silence of despair, but nothing prepared me for the shrine of the Mechanicus. I was led into a colossal chamber where ancient machines hummed with unholy life, their surfaces etched with sacred sigils and veins of glowing energy. The tech priests moved among them like priests tending to gods, their robes billowing in the heat and ozone-laden air, voices chanting calculations that intertwined logic and devotion. I watched as flesh and machine became inseparable. Servitors stood motionless, eyes glazed, bodies pierced with wires and tubes that siphoned their essence into the greater mechanism. The rituals were precise and unyielding. A needle here, a servo arm there, and the soul of a man reduced to numbers, energy, and a silent, humming thread feeding the omnipresent machine god. The priests themselves were more machine than man, their augmentations replacing sinew with steel, their faces half obscured by skull masks that glowed faintly with the power of worship. It struck me with cold clarity, the Imperium does not just demand service, it demands transformation, the complete surrender of self. Logic and faith were indistinguishable here. Thought was codified into ritual, devotion measured by efficiency, and man had become nothing more than another cog, an instrument in the symphony of machinery that spanned the world. The air smelled of ozone, burning lubricant, and incense, a strange mixture of the sacred and the sterile. And yet, within this terrifying precision, there was beauty. A terrible, alien beauty in the order, the harmony of worship, the unity of purpose. But it was a beauty that crushed as much as it awed, for it demanded that all individuality be erased, that one's very essence be fed into a system that cared nothing for joy, nothing for fear, nothing for hope. In the shadow of these rituals, I felt the full weight of the Imperium's devotion. It was not to protect life, but to bind it, to sanctify chains and turn obedience into reverence. I understood then the ultimate truth of the Mechanicus. The Imperium does not worship freedom. It worships its own shackles, and those who serve most faithfully find their identity dissolved, their souls melded into the gears and circuits of devotion. Even I, a weary civilian dragged through decades of service, felt the seductive power of order and the terrifying serenity of absolute obedience. The end came quietly as it always does in the Imperium. My body, racked by decades of toil across worlds and endless servitude, could no longer sustain the rhythm demanded by life. I lay on a cot in the infirmary of a decrepit hive spire, the air heavy with soot, the faint stench of burned servitor flesh lingering from a nearby factory. My breaths came shallow, each one a reminder that even the simplest act of survival had become a monumental effort. I reflected on the entirety of my existence. The gray monotony of the scriptorium, the poisoned fields of the Agri-World, the endless furnaces of the Forge World, the suffocating devotion on the Shrine World, the violence of the Underhive, the cold void of space, the relentless punishments of the penal legions, the opulence and treachery aboard the rogue trader, and the absolute logic of the Mechanicus. Every path had been suffering. Every promotion, every duty, every obedience had been nothing more than a chain. I felt the Arbite's gaze in my memory, the judgment of the tech priests, the whispers of the Inquisitor, the silent approval and disapproval of those who wielded authority over me. And now, in these final moments, all of it fell away. There would be no prayers, no absolution, no comfort from the Emperor. I refused. Not out of defiance for its own sake, but because there was nothing left to offer. My last words were not to the Imperium, not to its false gods or their unfeeling masters. They were to myself. I die not as a servant, I whispered, voice hoarse and trembling, but as a man who saw the truth. The infirmary was silent except for the occasional hiss of recycled air and the distant hum of machinery. No heroic music played, no final rites were offered. There was no light bathing me in salvation. Only the raw, honest weight of a life observed, endured, and finally released. And in that silence, I felt the haunting human truth of the Imperium, that survival is often meaningless, obedience is rarely noble, and those who serve are rarely seen. I had been a cog, a number, a footnote in a galaxy-spanning machine. But I had also been a witness. I had seen the truth, and in that, there was a strange, unspoken dignity, not heroic, not uplifting, but hauntingly human. You have witnessed the truth of life in the Imperium, the endless grind, the silent suffering, and the quiet defiance of those who live and die in its shadow. If you wish to delve deeper into the hidden stories, the forgotten corners, and the untold lives of the 41st millennium, subscribe to our channel. Every tale is a journey into the heart of humanity's struggle, dark, relentless, and unforgettable. Join us and bear witness to the Imperium as few ever will.